it's understanding that there are other opportunities outside of medicine that can balance it out. Find an area of medicine or an area around medicine that actually you're passionate about. Helping people along the way is really what makes the whole system tick. The view is there's a huge amount of bureaucracy and the NHS is one big entity. None of these things are true.
Welcome back to the More Than Medics podcast. Today we chat to Dr. Thomas Maggs, a practicing paediatrician and founder of the Medical Consulting Group. Tom has extensive experience in HealthTech, having served at TandemHealth, Zinc, Bitelabs, electronRx, just to name a few. Today we chat about how we can improve our employability in industry, what's needed for health startups to succeed, and how to balance clinical practice with the many different roles that a doctor can take on. Tom gave some really good advice on this one. We hope you enjoy.
Lovely to have you on, Thomas. So just before we start, can you just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your journey to where you are now?
Perfect. So I'm Tom. I'm a paediatrician by background. I graduated medical school in 2012 and then went straight through training up to about SD6 in pediatrics. But in the last 2 years of that, I got very interested in health tech. Initially transitioned down to 60% and was doing health tech 2 days a week, and then got a great opportunity to move into a health tech company as general manager of that product, and then eventually chief operating officer of the business. So I actually didn't practice for 3 years and gave up my training number. And then I've returned now to clinical practice 1 day a week, but at the same time started a company called the Medical Consulting Group, where we provide clinicians and specialist experts to health tech businesses to help get the voice of clinicians and clinical practitioners into businesses early so they make the best products that we can do, really.
Wonderful. So if we start from the beginning, what inspired you firstly to choose pediatrics as a specialty?
So very early on, I think some people have a calling to it, and some people actually just find that there's a specialty that suits them well. So I did my first in third year placements in pediatrics, and then did you have a specialist choice where you do an extra month. I chose pediatric oncology, really enjoyed the atmosphere on the wards, really enjoyed the sort of interaction with the team, and also quite the sort of flat hierarchy between even consultants all the way down to med students. Everyone was very happy to sort of chat and talk, and the interactions between doctors, nurses, and the rest of the team was something that really pulled me to it. And then once I'd finished F1 and F2, I did 1 year just to make sure in pediatric emergency medicine, and just loved it. It was, again, great patient group, great interaction with the parents, and also just the people in it are generally very nice. So it's a nice specialty to be in general.
Yeah, wow, amazing. And so you went sort of to ST6 level. Remind me, how many more years if you were to complete to become a consultant?
So there would have been another 3. So I was at the beginning of the season, there would have been another 3 to get to the end. It's now 7, but when I was training, it was 8. So still a decent chunk left, but I think it's not a huge amount. It would have been we could have finished from there, but I think it's about then. You realize as you go through training in the sort of 10 to 12 years, often the training starts from F1, F2 to when you finish. Well, most people will have 1 or 2 years out of at some point. It is a long journey. It's about matching and finding sort of opportunities that fit with you, and actually also then making the right decisions about your own career in that, really.
Yeah, that must have been a big step for you at the time, at least, jumping off of that training program that you've been on for 6 years. How did you sort of come to that choice that you made ultimately to leave and have some experience in industry?
Well, I think people think about a lot of things. People think when people leave medicine that they've left on some like big, profound moment where they decided that this isn't for me, or I'm going to go do something else. Mine wasn't like that. I really enjoyed training, and thought it was actually, it was very much made a big part of making me who I was, and I really enjoyed the practice. It was difficult, I have to say. That pediatrics is quite a full-on specialty in terms of number of hours and number of weekends and nights. But I wasn't in any way upset about doing it. The reason why I got involved actually was initially got involved in health tech through a friend. Somebody needed to create some medical content, started doing it on weekends and evenings. That grew into, would you like to do 2 days a week? And I said, okay, that sounds like a great opportunity. I don't need to leave my training. You know, why wouldn't I in some ways? Did that for a year, and then the opportunity came up to work full time in a business, and I was asked, would I be interested? Again, the School of Paediatrics is pretty supportive, gave me a full year out, then they actually gave me another full year out. So I only made the decision to leave pediatrics or step away from sort of the training scheme after 2 full years out of clinical practice. So I think the first thing I would say is that, you know, one of the hugely beneficial bits around medicine in general, no matter what specialty you're in, is, you know, that flexibility to be able to start your training, be able to drop in and do something else for a year, to experience industry, to come back to clinical practice. You know, if you were a lawyer or an accountant, you can just ask your firm to be able to just have a year doing another specialty and see whether you liked it. You know, the ability to do that in medicine is one of the best things, I think, about being in training. And I think if people don't experience some of that, they've probably missed out on a bit of an opportunity themselves.
That's really good to hear, because I think one thing that, for example, medical students might think about, or even early career doctors when they're about to choose which specialty they go down, is which specialty will allow me the opportunity to kind of have that flexibility in my time and explore these other passions. And usually what you hear is GP is the go-to one that people usually think about when it comes to work-life balance, being able to take on those extra responsibilities. So do you think that pediatrics does then allow that ability for you to take on those different responsibilities while still keeping your clinical training? And do you think that actually applies to a lot of the specialties from your experience?
I think it's changed very rapidly. So I first took time out to work in health tech in 2017, which sounds like a long time ago now, but you know, what isn't really. And at the time, it was, why would you leave medicine? That's crazy. What would you know, why would you now not be on the straight and narrow? Yeah, maybe you might leave to do some academics. Maybe there might be some family reasons, but the idea of leaving was crazy. That has changed a lot in terms of in that period of time. And people now say, you know, if you say I work in health tech, people say, oh, it's awesome, tell me more about it. And that is a drastic change in a sort of 6 or 7 year period. And that's not just in pediatrics, that's in all specialties. You're right, GP has traditionally been easier to step out or do other things. One of the really big things is because the training is so much shorter. So having a essentially 4 year training after F1, F2 is easier to, it's not so much that people are having time out during training, they're just finishing training and then deciding to do other things afterwards. And in health tech, there is no doubt, at least 50%, if not more, of people who work in health tech are GPs. And for exactly that reason, it's been easier for them to balance being a consultant as a GP and then also being involved in health tech. But the flow or the involvement of people in other specialties has changed dramatically. And it's not just that people are going to take a time out to work in industry. There's other opportunities that have come up in the NHS now to be involved in management, to be involved in, there's AI clinical fellow roles, there's lots of Darcy fellow roles where people are stepping out and doing something which isn't necessarily, the old route used to be, you did medicine, maybe you did some research, that is it. That's gone now. You can go and do a year of management, you could go and do a year abroad, you could go and do a year in industry. And actually, in some ways, I sort of feel if you don't do any of those things and you just go straight through, you sort of miss the great opportunity that you get given by being a medic. So yeah, I've got people now who are having time out of plastic surgery training, people having time out of urology, people having time out of orthopedics that we've worked with in recent years. Yeah, that, you know, you wouldn't have thought that those specialties would have been open to that, but they are, and the world has moved on from that. So particularly talking about being a medical student now, it's only going one way, which is more open to those changes rather than less. Yeah, those things are definitely open in all specialties now.
That's great to hear. And I just want to ask, why do you think there's been this sudden shift in perspective and perception on this topic? So suddenly,
I think one of the biggest things as well is actually it's not just happening at trainee level. It's happening that there's been a change at consultant level. So you used to be you think of consultants of being 100% clinical, but really that hasn't been the case and it hasn't been the case for 20 years. It's not just a new thing. But a lot of those people used to, you could only really get involved in clinical and then management. So you either ran a service, maybe you became the chief medical officer of a hospital, or involved in something of a lead role. Now a lot of those people are involved in other things. There's government bodies that are meaning that, say you're a rheumatologist, you want them to be involved in running rheumatology for a region rather than just your individual hospital. There's a lot more interlinking between services, and then there are more, because there are more private providers involved. There needs to be some clinicians involved in the sort of the chief medical officer roles, in the safety, in the production of some of these tools, even if they're offering services in the NHS. So there's a balance of those people still need to be practicing clinically. So a lot more people are involved, maybe 1 day a week, outside of the more traditional route, which is your maybe 4 days a week NHS, 1 day a week private practice seeing patients. Now there are other opportunities the doctors have to work in different areas.
Are there other opportunities because are there more sort of places per se for medics to sort of integrate into companies nowadays, or is it more so that medics are maybe thinking more laterally now and they can potentially slot in that way? What is it? Is it the growth of the health tech industry as a whole, or is it sort of medics just thinking more laterally nowadays?
So there's two versions of that. Medicine is still very highly regarded. If you're talking about, so some people leave medicine and then they go and do something which is completely different. So say you left and you wanted to do management consultancy, or you wanted to go and work in finance. There are a number of people who do leave and are not doing anything that's directly related to medicine. Generally, they end up, say you went into finance, you probably end up in the health aspect of finance, or same if you went to consultancy. So the first thing, which is, medicine is still a very highly regarded degree by lots of other things. You learn a lot of soft skills. You learn how to manage difficult situations, and there's obviously a base level of intelligence of having to got in, pass your exams, all of those process. That's one group, but I think really that group hasn't massively changed. There's been a group of people who left medicine for the last 15, 20 years. I think the biggest thing is there are more opportunities where medics are needed in non-directly clinical services, or non-directly NHS clinical services. And there's two ways that I would say that's expanded. One is private practice, and particularly the delivery of services outside of the NHS, is sort of like top-up services. So things where people are willing to spend some of their own money to deliver to access services that aren't necessarily delivered on the NHS. There's been a huge boom in those. All of those need clinicians to be involved. The things people think of when that is hair loss, or problems from that, but they've got a whole subsector of clinicians behind those type of products. And then there has been a boom of innovation and other sort of technology products, some of which are delivered in the NHS, some of which are sold globally, everything from sort of medical devices to new tests. All those things need clinicians to be involved earlier in the process, and those have just grown in size over the last 15, 20 years, and I think they've particularly grown in size over the last 6 to 7 in terms of funding. If you look at how many digital health products have got funding in the UK, it's grown a huge amount, and all those people need clinicians to be involved.
And I guess that's where your solution in the medical consulting group comes into, slots into quite nicely. So from my understanding, it's I'm going to butcher this, but it's matching maybe clinicians to clients or businesses that require clinician input. Yeah, but please do expand.
No, exactly that. So we connect health tech businesses and health tech professionals.
Right.
And so that spans everything from doctors, nurses, pharmacists, but also decision makers, people who are involved in the NHS. Really, our fundamental point is to try and make that businesses, it's easy for them to access people and make the right decisions. And then on the front line, you end up with products that are actually useful. And when we started it, we sort of treated it as, you should treat we think of money in the private sector as endless and money in the NHS as really finite, but it really isn't like that. There's a certain amount of money that's invested in health tech every year. If that money's wasted because businesses can't access clinicians or can't access the right one, then that means that you're going to get less products that actually make it to the front line and are successful and help patients and clinicians. So we really treat it as every pound spent in the private sectors should be treated like a pound spent in the public sector. And in order to do that, we think that getting the voice of clinicians in early means that they make better decisions and they're likely to build better products for the front line. So it's all about smoothing and making it easier for both sides of that, to increase really trust between both.
And how do you bridge those two kind of groups together then? What do you actually do to match them?
So I think it depends slightly on the case, but we've got a big network of about 1,500 clinicians that have signed up to our network that we can then reach out to. And what we do essentially is somebody will come to us with a problem, and you'll find, particularly at consultant level or even senior level, one of the issues is that doctors get approached all the time by lots of different projects, some free, some paid, some fully functioning, some ideas that haven't really got off the ground yet. And it's very difficult if you're a consultant. You've got 50 emails from businesses to understand who you should be speaking to, who really needs your help, who's got a great idea, who needs to think about it more and actually sort of detail it. And for many times, the assumption is actually that clinicians will just help out and they've got loads of time and they're really interested. The truth is they're very busy and they don't have loads of time. So firstly, we work with businesses to actually decide exactly what they need. Do you need the professor of this, or actually do you need a junior who understands how patients flow through A&E? It might be a very different picture. So firstly, we actually work with businesses to make sure that their requirements are needed. And then we work with the clinicians to make sure that their time's respected, they're paid on time, they've got the right protections, so that they can go into it eyes open, know exactly what they're being asked to do. And actually we get really, really good feedback from both sides, because both sides go into it with an open, sort of prepped understanding of what's going to be involved.
That's amazing. That sounds really good. So what are the sort of I guess skills or experience that clinicians have on that side? How can they sort of bolster their value offering to get the jobs that they want, essentially, or the roles that they want?
Yeah. So there's two things. Not every clinician is made to work well in health tech environments, and that's not a negative against it, but it's for there's lots of other opportunities outside that don't necessarily mean they're specific to health tech. But what that means often is it's around mentality and and really temperament and what you like or don't like. So whichever opportunity you say you want to work in health tech, you want to work in one of the digital companies that's creating products, say you wanted to work in some of the science companies, you really try and find an area of medicine or an area around medicine that actually you're passionate about in general, and then build that out. So if you become a specialist in anything, you will be more desirable in those areas. So there are different real ways to look at it. Really, the main way I would say to split it is you either become a generalist, and then you actually understand how the whole environment of health tech works, how funding works in the NHS, how commercial ideas work, understanding actually how does money flow from a ICB to a GP practice to actually, to just disperse with patients. And that's where someone like myself, I would say I'm a generalist. So I understand lots of things to a certain level. And that's like the skills that I've done. And then there's other people actually who become specialists. So for instance, if research is your thing, then a lot of these businesses need people who are specifically good at research to be involved in their projects. If AI is your thing, then if you've done extra courses on AI, then they might bring you on to work on rather than work on the whole idea of the business, they might be working on a specific part of, we're producing a software that's going to be used to predict some part of the clinical pathway. You might be the AI/clinical specialist who works with their team to build that. So I think the answer is either make yourself generally good and have a really good understanding of lots of things in the subject, in the area you're going to, like health tech, or become very specialized, and don't underestimate the value of your clinical knowledge as being something which is valuable to other people. So we will still go to the top liver oncologist or the top orthopedic doctor who's in hip and knees. Their value might be actually they've just got great clinical knowledge, and that in itself has a huge amount of value, not just in practice but also outside of that.
And how did you kind of gain your knowledge as a generalist in these kind of areas? Was it through your training? Was it through med school? And if it wasn't through those kind of two platforms, what do you wish, med school and the training pathways had taught you about health tech, for example?
Yeah, so definitely not from health tech. One of the big thing that I ended up, my first step out of medicine was into management. And that medicine did give me an advantage. I've been a registrar in pediatrics, and that meant you are the lead for the pediatric department overnight. That means you've got a ward, you've got an emergency department, you've got to manage patients in different areas, you've got to communicate with a team, you've got to understand who your juniors are and quickly understand what their skill sets are and all those bits. So there is a huge amount of leadership training that you get in medicine that you probably don't get at the same level or as quickly in other sort of career paths. So firstly, that would say that's one of the things I did definitely learn. The understanding to be a generalist around understanding how some of the business aspects learn. Very much I got dropped into the deep end. So I was working with a business, the opportunity came up, and actually my clinical skills had probably got me the role, or clinical and leadership skills had got me the role, but actually the understanding of how things worked on a business and commercial level, I had to learn very quickly. I did a course, a 2-week course at Cambridge University Business School, which was really, really useful. I could have done that before I started the role. So there is opportunities that people can do. You don't need to wait. I did an online MBA, which again, a lot of doctors do as part of their training a little bit later on. Those are both personal things, and they're quite big, I would say, commitments. There are lots of much lower hanging fruit. So a lot of people do free online courses. There's lots of small paid courses at things like Harvard Business School, or even some of the UK ones, which are medicine specific. And then the really biggest thing from my side of things is I read a lot of books that fitted around the areas where I felt I had a deficiency. So my personal opinion is that there's a huge amount you can learn from other people's experiences, and and the sort of areas where you've got gaps in your knowledge. And then the last bit I would say is just be very, very clear on where your skill set ends. Because one of the things about being a clinician outside of clinical practice is we're very used to, in medicine, you can't do anything unless you've got a badge saying that you can do it. Whereas in the real world, lots of people do lots of things that they didn't learn or train to do as part of their job. So there is a bit as well of being able to know, I know enough to be able to say, actually, I probably can do this thing that you're asking me to do. Whereas in medicine, we say, oh, I haven't been trained to do that, I won't do it. And the real world outside of the medical space is a bit different than that.
Yeah, I think medics, do you see them are perfectionists, aren't we? And so when we come into that environment, it can seem like there's a lot of imposter syndrome because we haven't passed maybe a test or got a qualification or learnt extraordinary amount about this area, but it doesn't mean that we can't provide value if it's north of what the company or organization currently have. So no, lots of good points there. So essentially, for the clinician to sort of slot themselves into health tech, they need to sort of educate themselves, whether that's through books, courses, or maybe and balancing that with just sort of chucking themselves in the deep end as you did, because you learn by doing. And then, pick if you're a generalist or a specialist, find your forte, know your competencies. But now, when we sort of switch now to the business side, what are the sort of things that make a business, a health tech business, succeed? And what, in your experience from running a medical consulting group, what are the companies that maybe do better? And what do you think is the reason behind that?
So understanding early on who their user base is going to be, but also who is going to actually pay for their service. So medicine is a little bit of it, or the health in general is a little bit of a different environment than, most startups work on the principle of sort of move fast and break things as a sort of traditional description, but also people work on something called the lean startup, a very famous book that people describe, build a lot of businesses around the model, which is try something, build something, try it, build something, try it, build something, try it, keep moving quickly. The problem with health is a lot of things are very heavily regulated. So because of that, there's a lot of companies that are able to raise money and then build a product for 2 or 3 years, and you don't actually get to test it on live people until you've managed to do that. So one of the biggest things I'd say in successful businesses are people have either managed to get access or information from the people who are eventually going to use it. So whether that's involvement with patient user groups, so say you were building a product and you knew it was going to be used by sufferers of MS, then getting people involved early on. So even if they're not using it in the live environments, they're actually just involved and understand what's involved. And then the real final bit is you can make something that's really, really great, that works well, that's tested well to show improvement, but is anyone actually going to pay for it? Does it fit into the current health system? Would it fit better in another country's health system? And sometimes if you can find products that work quite well, but they have a perfect fit in the health system. That's exactly what the NHS is looking for, digitizing a certain part of its journey or making things more efficient, and it will get snapped up super quickly. And then there's other bits where actually the product might fit between 2 or 3 parts. Should it be paid for by GP? Should it be paid for by hospitals? Oh, well, it's sort of a bit of neither, and then actually nobody ends up buying it at all, even if it would have been better in the end of the day. So there are 2 really big points is like, are you actually testing it on people who are going to be interested in using it? And then the last one is like, is there actually a commercial pathway for it to be used? Now the NHS isn't the only way that people can be commercially viable, but still the same question is often the case. You've got to balance, you've got to build something which is definitely going to be useful enough when you launch it in 2 to 3 years time, which is no easy task. The benefit is that there's a lot of things like grant funding and some other points around that can sometimes bridge that gap and make it easier for startups to actually get things to market. But there are easier areas to launch products if you wanted to do it from scratch.
And for the latter bit, figuring out whether it's commercially viable, how does one go about actually figuring that out? So obviously from the former point that you mentioned, that's a lot easier, I guess, doing your problem-based research, market-based research. Yeah. But how do you assess whether it's commercially viable?
So first thing I would do is speak to people who have managed to sell if the NHS is your product, sell to the NHS. It doesn't necessarily, it may not be. There's lots of health products that can be really, really useful. They might be direct to consumer products. They might be an international product. There might be other users that are not just the NHS. But the NHS is 2/3 of the spending of all health spending in the UK, if not more. So it is you can't avoid it being a big player in the UK. So speaking to those people and actually see how they navigate it. Things change. You can be lucky, so things do change, and you've got to accept that what you're researching and getting involved in now might be different in 3 years' time. There might be a different pot of money that's that becomes available because the government's trying to push a certain thing or not. But really, that's relatively rare. So most spending on a condition will generally move relatively slowly. So you can see say you're going to produce a product that was going to be in diabetes, what people are spending and how much is being spent on digital products, how much is being, there's no point in saying £1 billion is spent on diabetes a year, which is true, but actually 900 million of it is spent on diabetes staff, and then saying you're going to build a digital product, you're going to try and sell it to 200 million pounds worth of stuff. That money isn't real. So some of it is actually just understanding each bit of the market individually, and then understanding is there scope for your product being genuinely useful. And I think the final bit with that, if you do end up selling to the NHS, is understanding, are you replacing something, which actually is often the easiest way. So if you're saying my product is just better than the current system, that's fine, because often the money is allocated already and it's just being shifted from a worse system to your system. If you're not, and you're actually trying to make something which is completely novel, then how are you going to explain that? And is there, who would eventually be involved in purchasing it?
And so how did you go about, because obviously the nature of your organization is network based, which obviously are notoriously difficult to build because you need people or people using your service to make it useful in the first place. So how have you gone about sort of navigating all those difficulties regarding a market-based organization?
We produce a huge, so we don't do any outbound marketing, not one bit. So we don't contact anybody and say this is what our service is.
Okay.
We do everything from as inbound marketing. So we produce a huge amount of content on LinkedIn to help founders, and then a number of those founders will reach out to us for help. So the answer to your question in some ways is we chose something that we were passionate about. We wrote about things that we were experiencing in our own advisory work or roles, and this is the sort of 3 founders who are involved. And over time, that had a huge amount of value to people. So we building on something that you're passionate about is easier than trying to write something just for a business case. So that's how we've built from the ground up. Is say creating lots of content, attracting people that way. LinkedIn is a big thing for us, and really trying to help founders at an early stage, and then reciprocally they later on have reached out to us for further support.
And with the partnerships that you have with those companies who reach out to you guys for support, how do you maintain that strong partnership with them?
Give them a service that they want is the simplest way. So we're really lucky. I would say well over half of our partners continuously return for further bits of work, and often we start off with a small piece of work, it goes well, and then we continue with more. I think fundamentally we understand the problem that they're trying to fix. So again, and we're very we work very hard to communicate with them a huge amount about what we're doing. So if we're trying to find someone and it's going to take a week or two, we're very open about where we're up to, keeping them in the loop. So for us, there's a huge human aspect of what we do, and that is a really I think big selling point for a lot of our clients. But again, the biggest thing is giving them the service that they are paying for. So by the fact that we always do what we're doing and often over deliver on what we've said we're going to, the benefit to that is that people are then very keen to come back to you for other problems. So being reliable particularly as something like a consultancy service or a matching service like we are, that's the bit. And then we now have a huge amount of our work, probably at least 50% comes from referrals of other people saying, hey, we used Medical Consulting Group, we had a great time, you should use them for this other this other project. So I think the answer for that ever is if you deliver a good service, then the sort of return customer aspect of it deals with itself.
Yeah, I guess what I'm hearing more is the fact that to have a good partnership, there's that humanistic element to it, and it's the element of transparency within any partnership, like not only in just this case, but in any partnership that you have in the context of even, for example, in other areas, diverse areas within the healthcare landscape. It's keeping that humanistic, transparent, reliable aspect of partnership that will help them succeed.
I think medicine in general and health in general, the view is that in some ways there's a huge amount of bureaucracy and the NHS is one big entity. None of these things are true. Like the NHS is built from 30 or so ICBs. The ICBs are built from individually most 40 or 50 PCNs. That you're talking about huge amounts of organizations that build up to. So it's a very fragmented system, and a lot of people move jobs or roles or tasks in between all these points. So it's a really important point, whether it's in business or whether it's involved in the NHS as well. It's a very human driven beast in itself. So it is important to speak to people at conferences. It's important to, to meet people in real life. It's important to help people on things that might not be the direct, they might not be your direct client, but you'll help them direct them to a person who can help them in another area. And this isn't just for our business. This is in general, if you're a clinician or you're a medical student coming up the process, like helping people along the way is really what makes the whole system tick. And you can't overly digitize it or think that you're going to try and sort of trigger it in some, no AI system is going to come and break that up. Like it is still a very human driven business. And the benefit is you've often got a lot of humans who are extremely passionate about what they do. So they're nice people to meet because they have genuine passion about their tasks. But it is very human driven. I would say a lot more human driven than almost any other part of industry.
Yeah, I think on our last podcast, Dr. Dasgupta had a very similar sentiment. It's a small world, sort of healthcare in the UK at least. And you're going to bump into someone once. You're probably going to bump into them again, not so far into the future. So having those good relationships with people, even like, literally anyone, I think has that sort of domino effect later down the line can help you. Not that you should be making relationships just for your sort of game, but just for the sake of it. Having a good long-term relationship can be very fruitful in the future. I wanted to ask as well, on top of sort of networking and making those relationships, what are the other sorts of skills you would sort of advise early career medics to sort of try and hone and improve if they want to maybe co-found or found an organization or just get involved in health tech generally?
Yeah, so I wouldn't have said this a few years ago, but the world has moved on in terms of personal brand in those areas, in business in general, and in medicine. So the one thing I would say is actually understanding what your LinkedIn page, what your other, sort of other front-facing, business-facing aspects of what you do actually represent. And one of the best ways nowadays is actually to post small amount. You don't need to, you not need to be very regularly, but every now and then posting something that you're interested in, posting your opinion on something, so that actually over an extended period of time, you look like you've been interested in an area for many years, it's not something you just turned around 5 minutes ago and said, I'm going to apply for this job. And oh, by the way, now I'm really interested in AI, or I'm really interested in service delivery. Those things have become much more a much more important fact. So things like being involved in podcasts, things like being involved in events and planning, those aspects which used to be hidden in a CV are now a lot more publicly available. You can see what people are attending, what people have, you can post, hey, I'm at this conference this weekend. Would anybody is anybody else around? Would they like to grab a coffee? Things like that actually are hugely valuable. And I think particularly when people are being employed in health tech now is a lot more competitive than it used to be. There's a lot more clinicians who are interested in being involved at some point. So you have to stand out. You can't just have a plain CV saying, I did 4 months in A&E and 4 months in general practice in my F2. That isn't, people aren't interested in that stuff. That's the bare minimum. That's what everybody has done. So you're asking people, how to actually stand out. The traditional routes of being involved in research and those things are still valuable. Presenting at conferences, things are still valuable. But there's a route now to having an additional value, which is around your brand, how interested you were in things, how involved you've been in projects, which it just wasn't available. If you'd have done that 10 years ago, there'd been no way for you to display it, and it would have just been waste. It would have been your own time, and it might have been useful to chat about, but nobody would know about it. That is different now. You can establish that, and it can be very clear that things tie together into a single narrative of your career very early on.
Amazing. And I wanted to ask as well, considering you've managed to keep your clinical career alongside everything you do, how do you prevent burnout?
by doing medicine part-time. No, I've changed my view very heavily on medicine since I had a time out and then come back to it.
Mm.
I love practicing. I did a set of weekend nights this weekend, and loved it. It's a privilege to be involved in medicine. When you work in something else, you realize the privilege that it is in terms of people. You go to work and people are completely open with you about their lives, their biggest concerns. They're completely reliant on you in terms of helping. The vast majority of people are extremely thankful, and really, appreciate your efforts and involvement. That isn't common, like in other jobs. So firstly, I would say that there is a real lovely feedback and relationship you have with patients. It is hard though. I used to do 4 sets of nights and then you go straight into another week, and particularly in something like pediatrics, which can be quite draining from an empathy perspective. I remember getting to the end of four nights and wanting to be more empathetic with patients, but really struggling because you're just so tired. And often what happens from that is you actually remain empathetic with your patients, but then your family suffer on the other end because you've used up your empathy, and by the time you get to a weekend, you're just tired and a bit grumpy. Less of a problem now because I don't. My 1 shift a week is I've got plenty of empathy to use that and still feel energized at home. But I think the answer in some ways is not. It's understanding that there are other opportunities outside of medicine that can balance it out, and that doesn't mean leaving. I left medicine to do 4 days a week something else. That's a personal choice, but there's lots of other people who do that by 3 days a week clinical and 2 days a week teaching, or 3 days a week clinical and 2 days a week management. There are so many different routes, and I think sometimes when you go through training, you feel like there's never a way out, and it's just forever, particularly on something like PEDS, which is 2 years F1, F2, 8 years training. But actually, that just isn't true. By the time you get to consultant life, by the time you get further on, the lifestyle is a lot different. So really, in some ways, the burnout aspect is, can you get to the end and have enjoyed the journey, rather than it is, it's going to be forever and you're going to be burnt out if you just keep going.
Awesome. Honestly, so nice to be able to speak to someone who's at the sort of, he's also juggling your clinical career, but also at the intersect between helping clinicians find sort of businesses to work with or in, and then helping businesses as well, because that's something I think a lot of medics are interested in, both in starting something for themselves as the business, or helping other organizations or being part of other organizations as the clinician, I guess, principally. I wanted to ask now, just maybe to finish, what is sort of the one piece or two, if you like, of advice that you'd give early career doctors today, given your experience with the medical consulting group, your own career, and how they can best sort of fulfill their career passions and dreams?
Yeah, so I think the one piece of advice that particularly I think gets lost in it, is that the time that you spend doing clinical practice and getting better at your clinical specialty has value. I think a lot of the time, because it's just you roll from F1 to F2 and ST1 to ST2, you feel like, oh well, I haven't really gained or moved forward. But actually, from somebody who works with a lot of clinicians, or and speaks to them at different points in their journey, you are creating value and learning and moving forward every day for the years and the time that you're spending practicing clinically. And that might even be, even the times you're going through, for every year you go through medical school. So you're creating value not just by actually doing the work and helping people and being a clinician, but you're creating value in yourself. And I think that's the one big bit I think that gets often lost. There's lots of things extracurricular that you can be involved in, enjoy them. And then the last thing I would say is just understanding that medicine is an unbelievably flexible career path compared to almost anything else. You might have to fight for some stuff. You might have to ask twice, or you might have to, somebody will send you an email back from the deanery saying, you sure, can we shuffle things around? But actually, most of the time, if you push and you're genuinely passionate about something, they will let you do almost anything. And if you go through the whole pathway and go through clinical training and don't take advantage of any of that flexibility, you've probably missed a trick, because those are the bits of medicine that actually make it really fun.
That's fantastic to hear that advice, especially regarding the flexibility element, because I think that's one thing that's kind of drilled into us, thinking that, medicine isn't as flexible, when I think now times have changed, and because of these new opportunities, we now actually have this flexibility to explore them. And the fact that medicine is not a sprint, it's a marathon. You can take time out earlier on in your career to take part in these opportunities, or you can do it later on in your career, like you've done after a few years of training. And like you said, you're always creating value every day, whether you're doing these opportunities or even as a clinician in itself. It's going to help you with the future opportunities you take.
Yeah,
So
and just another thought. So I also wanted, you said, how it's something that you are genuinely passionate about. Sort of, it's a problem that you've experienced, I'm guessing, and something that you've put a lot of work into in terms of providing content on LinkedIn, as you say, quite frequently to help people. And I think at the crux of it, that is probably at the heart of what's been able to give the company success, is because there's a sort of underlying foundational passion there that you're able to sort of day in, day out provide value and enjoy it. And I think Yasmin and I feel the same with More Than Medics. I mean, we spend too much time that we'd like to admit on this, but it doesn't feel like work. It's enjoyable. And I think if you can find work that at the foundation you're really passionate about it and you intrinsically just love it, then that can only sort of ever lead to something amazing, something that enriches your life in ways you can't really fathom. And that I'm at the early stages now, because we've just sort of started, but it's a really nice feeling. It's not a feeling I've had before, and I'd like to keep having that feeling and sort of keep going towards opportunities and initiatives that I'm intrinsically really passionate about, rather than just doing it as a sort of a tick box necessarily. But yeah, are there any sort of finishing things you'd want to mention to our listeners?
No, I think just actually adding on to that, exactly. You're that being passionate about, I think sometimes in medicine it can be really difficult if you're finding the clinical work hard. The view is that you've worked so long, you've been committed often since the age of 14, you've been told repeatedly, like, oh, you'll be great at this. You've been told, by parents, every time you tell another parent when you're 14 that you might want to do medicine, everyone says, isn't that great? To admit sometimes that you're struggling with the passion is really hard. And I think a lot of people really, firstly to their parents, but also just general family wise, they find it very difficult to admit that that might be a thing. So from my side, I would say that that's one thing to just, talk about it early. Don't try and wait until the last moment to discuss that. But the other bit is like you're getting with More Than Medics and that I get with MCG is you can increase your passion for medicine sometimes by actually being involved in other things that are not medicine.
Yeah.
And actually you see that who burns out. Often it's the people who just bury themselves in only clinical work. And you think, well, how can adding something which is non-clinical on top, which is going to take more time and going to be, going to tire me out more, going to make me feel like I've got more energy? But it really does.
Yeah.
It's the same people that play sport or in a band or doing other things outside of medicine. They supplement your career and they can actually make you enjoy the actual central points of clinical practice much more as well.
Yeah, I think we're also, to get into medical school, we have to be this multi-talented sort of crazy individual that loves sports and loves this and loves that. But then when we get into med school, there's the massive tendency to just sort of shut everything else down and just focus on med. But I think as individuals, sort of bred to get into med school, this is the sort of stuff we enjoy as well. Doing extracurricular, supracurricular activities, and so I think we need to get away from that sort of idea that we should stifle other things and maybe just sort of stick to the sort of the normal path. But so lovely to chat to you, and thank you so much for your insights again. So valuable given your experience and your work with the Medical Consulting Group. So yeah, looking forward to see how it grows and where your career takes you next.
Pleasure. Great to speak to you both.
Thank you.